Hey y'all. Question for today is, were swords a consumable item? Historically speaking, were swords consumable, or were they something that was expected to last? And of course, the answer to that is yes to both, depending on the situation. And of course, I'm painting with a really broad brush here, talking about swords in general. And when you're looking at different historical periods and different cultures, there might be some strong level of nuance to the answers to that. But just let me give you a couple of anecdotes here. So the first anecdote I have for you here is from a video that Paul Martin shot on YouTube. And Paul Martin is a expert on Japanese swords in the English language, and he's a real good source of information and someone I would definitely consider an expert on those things. And I was watching a video where he was exploring the Katetsu sword and looking at its historical reality of it, and he's interviewing another gentleman who is a Japanese sword expert whose name is Toshina Gon. And they're talking about Kondo Isami, who was one of the Shinsengumi and also fought in the Boshin War. And, in the context of the Boshin War, Toshida Gon said this about a letter that Kondo Isami had written. He says, this was written in July 1864. He also said that the sword had incurred many chips and looked like a saw. Paul Martin says, it is said that Shinsengumi use swords often, so they may have had a lot of swords. Toshina Gon responds, it's a consumable item. There is never just one, and they purchased various ones themselves, as well as ones given by the Aizu clan, etc. And later on he says, first of all, there are many records of swords that were issued as consumable to captains of the Shinsengumi. And in that interview, he goes on to talk about how difficult it might have been on the salary that they received to purchase swords, and how they were getting swords from different sources. So I've heard a lot of people discussing katanas and Japanese swordsmanship that talk about the katana as a sword that was not a consumable item, that was a super special, super sacred sort of item. And swords, and it's routine to find swords that are very, very old. There are a lot of very, very old Japanese katana, at least relative to the number of swords that you find of the same age and the same condition from other cultures. And of course there are reasons for that, but other than just how they fought with the swords and how much damage the swords incurred when actually being used. But the point here is you have a Japanese sword expert, matter of factly just saying that, these swords got chewed up and they were expendable, and if you actually use them in battle, they would get severely damaged to the point that they would routinely need to be replaced with new swords that were undamaged. So to me, that's something to consider and think about. And, remember, Kondo Isami refers to a sword that had so many chips that it looked like a saw. So here I've got a book, The Unconquered Knight. And this is about a chronicle of the deeds of Don Pero Nino, Count of Buelna. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, just like I probably wasn't pronouncing those Japanese names right. But anyway, read a little excerpt from this. Weariness brought the battle to an end on both sides. When Pero Nino went back, his good shield was tattered all in pieces. His sword had its gilded hilt almost broken and wrenched away, and the blade was toothed like a saw and dyed with blood. And well do I think that until that day, Pero Nino never had been able to glut himself in an hour with the toil he craved. For the truth is that the fight lasted for 2 whole hours, and that his armor was broken in several places by lance heads, of which some had entered the flesh and drawn blood, although the coat was of great strength. It had been given to him by a great lady. Should I say by a queen, I should not lie. And it goes on, that kind of stuff. But you see, again, we're talking about a blade that was toothed like a saw, and this is from the 1400s. So this is like 400 years earlier time period, and this is, Europe versus Japan, so almost on the other side of the world. So swords in a fight seemed like in a lot of places and a lot of times they would get heavily damaged and would need to be replaced if you actually use them in a fight. Of course, swords were sidearms in most time periods and most cultures, so people are going to be using spears and pole arms and missile weapons and other things instead as their primary weapon. But when you take that sword out, you expect it to get damaged. And what you're concerned with in that moment is probably more so staying alive than, your precious sword getting damaged. Modern collectors of swords, we have a tendency to fetishize swords and put swords on a pedestal and venerate them in a certain way. And they were certainly venerated and treated with respect in historical periods. But the point is, these are our babies that we purchased, and the thought of one of these getting abused or beat up to the point that the blade is so damaged that it's unfixable, or the hilt or fittings getting chewed up like that we spend our hard-earned money is something that is really hard for us to think of. And we also treat these as these venerable objects of art, not just as these weapons and tools that a lot of people historically would have seen them as. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, for sure, I think swords that weren't being used in combat on a regular basis probably lasted a really long time. But then again, people might carry a sword their whole life, even if they were a samurai, even if they were a knight, and might not ever actually use that sword in actual combat. Because, that's just the reality that the majority of swords made in history probably were just worn and never actually used. A lot were, but a whole lot more weren't, I would, speculate. And of course, I'm not, I'm just some dude on the internet. So, don't take my opinion for all of this. But it's something to think about because, I see so many people that treat swords, this idea that they would never, that people would go to extraordinary lengths in how they practice their swordsmanship and how they parry and block to prevent the swords from being damaged. And, I don't think swordsmen will go out of their way to do perpendicular edge-on-edge blocking with their swords in a way that was just heedless of damaging the sword. But I just think that, in any case in a chaotic fight, that no matter how well trained you are as a swordsman, that you're just going to it's very likely that you could ruin a traditionally made sword. And another part of that element, I think, is not every historical warrior was this super highly trained martial artist. And, I think the majority of people who carried swords probably did train with them to a certain or lesser extent. But, your average knight is probably far more concerned with things like horsemanship, being able to use the lance, and different kinds of combat strategies that go well beyond the scope of simply being good with the sword. So, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of things you can get into that with. But that's something I would invite you to research and study and think about is make sure you're not having too much bias for our modern sensibility as someone who collects these objects, and take some time to kind of research a little bit and have a more realistic kind of attitude toward what probably happened when swords were actually used in combat. Y'all have a good day.